Hey adventurers, so today is going to be another book review. This is going to be for Taliesen by Stephen R. Lawhead. This is the first book in the Pendragon Cycle, which is a 6-book series now, I believe. If the Aurelia, I believe is the book, what the book's called, has come out. I'm not sure if it has and I haven't read it yet. But anyways, so Taliesen is the first book in the Pendragon Cycle by Stephen R. Lawhead. I should mention the kind of genres and keywords and stuff like that. This is Arthuriana, so it's a King Arthur series, historical fantasy, and a little bit of religious fantasy, or has some religious themes tied into it for sure. So Taliesen is the first book in the Pendragon Cycle by Stephen R. Lawhead. This series is an attempt to tell the tale of King Arthur in a more historical manner, as well as with a focus on religion and Christianity versus the pagan and druidic cultures. And so that's really what makes this unique from the other Arthurian stories, other than that it's a different author. But it separates itself in what it's trying to say with this series and how it's trying to retell the myth. So this book started out pretty slow. I liked that the fall of Atlantis was a major part of this story, but there was something about the writing of it that really didn't engage me at the beginning. It was a bit disappointing that I wasn't engaged from the beginning, because I should have been. This is exactly the type of story that I tend to love, including the writing. That's the type of writing where that this is usually the type of writing that I love, and for some reason it just wasn't clicking with me in the way that I was hoping that it would. But also, more than just the writing, the setting and the world, it's usually something that works so well for me, but for some reason to start out I was just having a really hard time getting into it. That did eventually change though. So while it did take me a while to get into this book, eventually I did, and I eventually got to the point where, okay, now I'm interested, now I see what's going on, and now I want to continue. This story is really pre-Arthurian, this book especially, Taliesen, because it takes place before Arthur has even been born, and I believe before Uther has even been born. So it's definitely pre-Arthurian, but it sets up for the rest of the series. And instead of telling the story of King Arthur, it tells the story of Taliesen, who is a bard. And I really loved his story, Taliesen's story. I feel like that was a story that needed to be told, and I understand why Lawhead chose to start this series with Taliesen, with the story of Taliesen. There's not nearly enough stories that focus on music or have a bard as a main character, and so that also was something that I really enjoyed, being a musician myself and someone who, if I were to be in a fantasy world, most likely what I would be is like a bard or a traveling storyteller, gleeman, or something like that. Probably an NPC, quite honestly. But still, it would be that's the type of character that I would most likely be based on my interests and my skills that I have. And so because of that, I love seeing stories about bards or about music that are heavily influenced by music. So I also became very attached to the character of Taliesen, as well as that of his parents. I thought both of those storylines were very important and very poignant to me in a lot of ways. He is one of the characters that I would have loved to spend more time with. He's just such an interesting character, and I really feel like we don't get enough time to spend with this character. And I just wish we had more time to spend with him, because he's a very, very fascinating character. One of the things that is very important to me about Arthurian literature, though, is that it respects the Arthurian legend. And that's kind of weird to say, and it seems like, oh, well, if you're writing an Arthurian tale, it's going to respect the Arthurian myth. Except that I did not feel that that was the case with The Once and Future King, and I'll touch more on that in a second here. So it's very important to me that a Arthurian retelling respects the myth. And I felt like, although it's very different from most other Arthurian stuff, that this book did exactly that. It really respected the Arthurian myth, and part of that is because it sets itself before most of the Arthurian myth happens, and so you can kind of set yourself outside of that myth to some degree. It's kind of the same thing that Leoness Trilogy by Zach Vance does, but it felt right. It felt like it fit right in within the mythos and respected what had come before while also doing its own thing. This is in large part why I didn't care for The Once and Future King, as I just mentioned. The Once and Future King didn't really feel like it was respecting the Arthurian myth, and I talk about that in my review of the Once and Future King. So if you want to know more about that, I definitely recommend going and watching that. I will try and link that up in the cards. But this truly feels like a facet of the Arthurian tale rather than a disrespectful retelling, and it filled out the world so much more. It just, the fact that it focuses on Atlantis and how that plays in, and who the Fisher King is, a very fascinating character from Arthurian mythology who really just exists in most stories, whereas this actually gives you his background to some degree, as well as the Lady of the Lake. That's another important thing that this book sets up. So those two characters are really important to this mythology. And although this book did start off a little bit slow for me, I did actually end up really enjoying it. I became more and more invested as I read, and about 30% I had truly started to enjoy the book as well. So what I ended up doing with this one is I read the first roughly 30% on physical, in this physical copy that I had, and then I ran out of time to physically read, so I went back to work, so I just got the audiobook and listened to the audiobook as well. And so that helped. Okay, oftentimes I can just blow through things on audio without having quite as much investment in them, but this one I was actually getting invested with the physical reading before I started the audiobook, so that was also nice to have. I had truly started to enjoy the book as well by the time that I picked up that audio, so which is what I just mentioned, so that's good. I'm very glad that I did start enjoying this book, because it'd be really disappointing to me for me to start a very highly anticipated, for me, Arthurian fantasy series that's brand new to me. It's not a new series, but it's brand new to me because I haven't read it before and I don't know anything about it or very much about it, and just to have this highly anticipated series that I start and DNF the series at 30% of the first book because I just couldn't get into it, that would be very disappointing to me. And so I'm very glad that I did end up enjoying this first book. And I'm very happy that it turned out to be a good book as well, a good story as well. I was also extremely surprised by how hard the ending of this book hit. Much harder than I would have expected. I understand the necessity of it and how it fits into the story of the series, but that doesn't make it easier. I feel like this ending hit me specifically really hard in a way that I was not expecting to. And that's a good thing. I truly feel that that's a good thing for both the book and for the series. I can't say this very often, but I see myself in this story in ways that I really never would have expected to. That alone is enough to make me appreciate the story, but then when you add on top of that the character of Taliesen, the fact that he's a bard and all that kind of stuff, as well as the other characters that are brought into this story, and the character type, which is the bard that I mentioned that I really enjoy, also in a world that I love, which is Arthurian, with a story that's well written, it just makes me enjoy it and appreciate it all the more, because I find myself relating to aspects of this story in ways that I never have before and never would have expected to. I did absolutely prioritize this series since I knew there was an adaptation coming out. There's probably other book series Arthurian book series that I was more excited about, just strictly on knowledge of the books, but I know there's an adaptation coming for this series, and it should be very soon coming out here. I don't know when. I will absolutely be prioritizing watching that once it does start airing, but because of that show coming out, I did prioritize reading this series because I knew that it was going to be something that I'd want to read before I watched the show. I don't know how good the series will be, but of course I'm hopeful and actually really, really excited for the series. I love Arthurian TV shows. Merlin is one of my favorite TV shows of all time, and I just want another really good Arthurian TV show that I can watch. And so I'm hopeful that the Pendragon Cycle is good, and that I can have another fun, great Arthurian TV show to watch. Obviously, I hope that it's a faithful adaptation, but as I've talked about several times, as long as the story is good, and as long as it's telling a good story, even if the adaptation isn't perfectly faithful, I can enjoy the adaptation. This is my problem with lots of things. Wheel of Time and Rings of Power, those weren't great. Those are not very good stories, and so I didn't enjoy them. However, How to Train Your Dragon, those movies are nothing at all like the books, and I would argue that they're better than the books. Different audiences too, but I would argue that they're better than the books, even though the adaptation is not a faithful adaptation. And so It doesn't have to be faithful. I would prefer it to be, obviously, but as long as it's good, I'm going to be happy, and I just want another Arthurian TV show that I can be watching. So that is my review of Taliesen by Stephen R. Lawhead. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite adventure. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, and we will see you guys again soon. Stay warm.